The TRX4M Warthog chassis is here. Hello everyone, thank you for stopping by and checking out this video. I know I've been MIA for about 8 months at this point, but I've been busy, shipping orders, working my day job, and life just gets in the way sometimes. So, I'm back with a new product here. This is the Warthog chassis for the TRX4M platform. So many of you are familiar with my SCX24 Warthogs. These things have been an absolute hit. We sold a ton of those chassis. It seems like the community really likes them, so I want to do something similar for the TRX4M. Introducing the TRX4M Warthog here. You can see the center of gravity is about as slammed as it can possibly be. I think they look absolutely killer, but perform even better. So in this video today, I'm going to be showing you how to convert your TRX4M into a Warthog with my chassis kit here. This will be the how-to build video. I will also be posting a separate video with running clips, performance, things of that nature. So that video will be linked in the description as I am dropping them at the same time. Again, these will be for sale on my Etsy shop. The link is in the description below. I'm super excited to launch this, super excited to get out a new video. So if you want to see how to build one of these things, please hang out. If you like the video, feel free to like the video below or subscribe to the channel. Again, I would really appreciate it if you do enjoy my content, but let's jump into the build process for the Warthog here. Starting off, you're going to need to disassemble your stock TRX4M and have these components here. So you see we've got our center skid plate, transmission, as well as the links that are associated with that connected, the hardware that attaches that skid plate to your stock chassis. We've got our steering servo removed and all of our steering linkages removed. That's going to be because we are going to be replacing those for the front steering on this thing. We've got our rear axle here with the associated links, some more front links that came off the stock vehicle, ESC, shocks, all the associated hardware, and of course the battery and the battery strap. This kit does not require any additional parts other than what come on your stock TRX4M and what comes in the kit. So in the kit you'll see that you get a couple of the side plates for the chassis, the roof, the battery mount, hood, some steering components. This will be printed in the color of your choice when you order it. I just have mine in red here for prototyping purposes. Then we'll get some shock spacers as well as a little bit of hardware. We'll need a new piece of hardware for our steering system and then the bolts to hold the chassis together. So let's jump right into the specifics. Starting off, what you will need to do, you will need to modify your front axle slightly. So you can see here on mine, this ear on the right hand side and this ear on the left hand side have been trimmed down to match the height of the center little pin there. That's because we're going to be taking our stock vertical position of the steering servo and we're going to be putting it flat to help reduce that the look on the front end. Mainly aesthetic, but I personally do prefer steering systems that work like this as opposed to how Traxxas had theirs set up. So just be aware that you will need to trim this ear and this ear. Another modification that you will have to make is we're going to be installing our shocks upside down. So that's in order to clear the chassis. One thing to note is you cannot run springs on this chassis in the standard configuration. What I mean by that is there's just simply not enough clearance between the chassis and the shock to put the stock spring and shock boot on there. I'm sure some people will get creative and play with ways to do that if they prefer to run springs, but for a build like this, I strongly recommend not running any springs. So when we flip our shocks, the only issue I ran into is that you'll have a slight bit of rubbing that will happen when you install the rears on upside down. So those will rub against the chassis. It won't have fluid movement. So what I did is I just took a little bit of side cutters and I just trimmed the top there. There's probably more eloquent ways to do this. You can see we're missing a little material there compared to the fronts, which I haven't modified. We'll put those side by side so you can see how much I trimmed. More elegant solution as opposed to just trimming that with like a side cutters or something as I did is probably to use some sandpaper or a file or something of that sort. But for illustrative purposes, it will work great. That just reduces friction. You probably could assemble it without modifying those, but you'll definitely get increased friction and less flex on the rear end if you choose to do so. That's as far as the modifications go to your original equipment that comes off the TRX4M. The rest is just bolt on, plug and play. So let's jump into the assembly of it. We're going to start off by mounting our shocks to their axles after doing the previously discussed modification. But starting with the front axle, what we want to do is we want to make sure our links are lined up. Remember, motor faces forward if you do disassemble it this far. And we're just going to put our link through there, as well as our shock. So let's get our bolt ready. We want our stock shock bolts on the lower end. Grab that stock shock bolt, get it lined up into here. Then we grab our link, slide it up in there, slide the bolt through, and get that zipped up tight. This whole part I will be fast forwarding through so you guys don't have to watch me suffer through these bolts. Note when you're installing the rear, you're going to need to do that trimming on the top of your shocks before you install them. Again, that's trimming on the shock cap here, which will now be the bottom of your shock because you have to install it upside down to allow for proper clearancing on this chassis. Alrighty, now that we have our shocks installed upside down and our main chassis piece almost ready to go, we're going to start by putting our new steering system on this thing. So what you're going to need is you're going to need your steering servo from your TRX4M, and you're also going to need the new servo mount. So what you'll need to do to the servo is just remove the servo horn and put it in a downward facing on the right hand side orientation. What this is going to do is just allow it to work on the flat plane as opposed to being installed in the vertical plane. So once you do that, center your servo, install your servo horn. Then you're just going to drop your servo into this new servo mount. You can see these ears that are coming off the bottom. It is the flat plane that the front of the servo mounts to. We're then going to take our stock servo hardware, which I have sitting right over here, and we're going to install our servo into this mount just like we would on any other mount. Next up, we're going to get this servo housing on our front axle like so. Get that bolt started. That's the stock bolt for the servo housing. Then I'm going to go ahead and slide one of my front links in from the back, of course. Stock orientation, you can see it sitting right there because we'll need that in place before we run our bolt through anymore. So we got that one lined up and started. Then we'll take the second link without hopefully dropping the whole chassis and slide that into the second slot there. Hopefully you can see that, and drive that all the way through. Take your time with this step. Getting everything lined up can be a bit tedious, but you'll know everything's lined up and installed when both your links are snug in there and secured, and you can see a little bit of that bolt protruding from the left hand side here. Next, what we're going to need to do is take our stock steering linkage, this one in particular, and remove our pivot balls on the left and the right hand side. You can use anything for this really. I prefer to use this little 1/4 inch hex driver, but I just take it, push it in the end, just be nice and gentle with it, give it a firm push, and you'll get the pivot ball out. So we're going to take that and set it to the side, and then also same thing with the other side. So I'm just going to get that in there, push, and I just shot it across my basement, so let me go grab that. And we found it, luckily. One thing to keep in mind, maybe do this facing down at your workstation or somewhere soft, somewhere very visible, because these things do like to go flying and you do need them to complete the build. The next step of the build, we're going to take this piece here. This is going to be one of the new parts of your steering linkage. We're going to go ahead and install our pivot balls that we just removed into this. So basically the reverse of what we just did. This one I was able to install with my fingers, no problem. So you can see we've got that pivot ball installed there. And then also, the other one, we're going to do the same thing. Just take that pivot ball, push it in, snaps in nicely, get it centered, and that is your new piece of your steering linkage. So to install that, we are going to want to take our bolt from our stock steering setup, and that's actually going to run through and into the back of your servo horn. So we will need to remove the servo horn for this step as well. And this requires a 2mm bit as opposed to the 1.5 that we've been using so far. I'm going to face it down now that I loosened it, just so I don't have to reclock my servo position. And then we'll take that. That's going to go right into the back of your servo horn. Just make note that that's going to go facing the back of the servo horn here. Make sure it can still rotate freely without too much slop, and that's what we got there. So next we'll take this, Reinstall that onto our servo as straight as we can have it. And send that back in. The next step we'll need to do is grab our new steering linkage, which will look something like this. We're going to start with the right side just because it is the simplest. Take the stock hardware for the right hand side. And we're going to take that and install this link just like you would any other link. So the bow faces out, of course. That's to provide clearance to your, I guess what I would call a differential cover, but technically it's just a spool and not a differential, I suppose. And then we'll just run that bolt right up into the stock home. Make sure these are lined up. I can see it being relatively easy to crack a knuckle when you're doing this. Don't go too tight on these either, because you want this to have a nice easy motion, right? When it's steering, you don't want there to be any binding. So just be courteous when you're installing all these parts. Make sure you're not snugging anything up too much, because that will definitely make your experience a little worse. Next up, we'll be installing this included bolt with the kit. So what comes in the kit is this bolt here. It's longer than the stock link bolt, and there's a reason for that. So we're going to take that, run it up through the right hand side knuckle, get that started into our new steering link. Just like so. And then we're going to want to thread that up, and that's a 2mm as well. So we'll switch back to our 2mm hex driver. And we're going to want to run that up through the knuckle. Let me turn up the clutch on my DeWalt here. And then just all the way up until the bottom of the head hits the bottom of that knuckle. Again, don't go too crazy tight on these. You want to make sure that it can still flow freely. After that, the key 9 debung, you may have seen what's going to go on next. So we're going to drop our link that we previously installed on the top of that, and then also take the nut that comes with the kit and just thread that on the top here. I chose a nylon or a plastic nut for this. This is just going to act similar to a nylock nut, but without as much weight. So there we go. We got our steering system installed. So now you can see we went from the vertical steering to a horizontal steering setup. Next, we're going to be actually installing this chassis. So first step of this is going to come unassembled as opposed to assembled like the SCX24 Warthog chassis comes. But we're going to start by grabbing either the right hand or the left hand side chassis plate. We've got our shocks here. We want to get those mounted up to it before we assemble, since they are inward facing. So you're going to need your stock shock upper bolts, and also you're going to start grabbing these little spacers that come with your kit. You're going to take your shock mounted in the upside down position as we did previously, put the bolt through it, and then take your spacer and put that onto the other side of the bolt. This is going to space it off from the side plate and just allow enough clearance for that to articulate properly. Then we're going to take this, and I prefer with the stock setup to install it for the rear in this top hole here, the first one below that center line of the chassis. So that's going to go right here. I'll start by hand threading it, and then we'll take our tool and thread it all the way in. One thing to note, when you are installing these, you want to sell a nice light snug connection. You don't have to torque them too tight, as it is easy to strip out the 3D printed material, but if you do take notice to that, you will not have any issues. I'm going to do the same for the other 4 corners and fast forward through those, and we will move on. Now for the front, I personally prefer to use this hole right here along the center line and in the rear. I have included other holes for you guys to play around with shock setups and figure out your desired suspension geometry, but I found these work best for my stock configuration. Again, just going to snug that up lightly, not going too tight so I don't strip out those holes, and then we'll do the other side and fast forward through that. Okay, now that we have our side plates mounted to our shocks, one thing I'm going to do right now is just pull these these servo leads out of the way, motor lead and servo lead. And then I'm also going to connect my drive shafts now before I forget to, once we get to adding in those links in their appropriate positions. So get your drive shafts lined up and reconnected, both front and rear. There we go. Axles are connected, wires are out of the way. Now we're going to go ahead and mount the chassis itself to the skid plate or transmission holder, whatever you'd like to call it. Make sure you put your links back into the associated holes before you go ahead and send your bolts in. So I like to start by, there's a hole in the front and the rear of each of these chassis plates at the bottom. I like to start by running my bolt through there. Then we'll go ahead and take this, line it up with the skid plate, and push it home. So now it's through the skid plate and through the link. There we go. And we'll do the same for the front before we snug those down. This can be another tedious part behind the servo and getting those links lined up. If you've worked on these things before, as I'm sure many of you have, you know it can be a bit of a tedious process getting links lined up and things of that nature. Alrighty, I've also included a small hole for the stock little retaining bolt to go on, and that is right behind your front bolt, so we'll put that in here. Again, this is another one of those that you don't need to get too tight, just a light snug, and that will be good to go. Alrighty, now we basically have our chassis assembled. You can see your front suspension should work as it is intended to. So we can flex it, we can steer it, we're good there. Same thing with the rear. Got full articulation. The next step is going to be to install the hood. So we're going to take our hood, take one of the included M2 bolts. Those will be silver. And we're just going to line it up with the frontmost hole on the chassis. Get that one started. Get our hood in there. And then send the bolt home. Again, just be courteous when you're installing the bolts into your 3D printed parts. They are relatively tough. They do hold threads just fine as long as you do not strip them out. So we'll run that in. If you're running one of these DeWalt's, I like to assemble these chassis using the 1 or the 2 setting on the clutch. Okay, we got our hood installed. Next up, we will go ahead and install our speed controller so we can get that wired up. So, speed controller is going to go in with the antenna facing backwards. You're just going to go ahead and plug your steering servo into the steering servo JST plug there, and then also your motor into the motor plug there. These are all designed so you cannot plug them in backwards, which is great. Next up, you can see this just kind of floats in here too, something to keep in mind. There are little tabs for it to rest on there. You can use 3M double-sided tape or something of that along those lines to mount this in there, or you could also just use a zip tie or something like that. Regardless, in the assembled state, this will move around slightly, but it is captivated, it is held in place by the roof piece, and you shouldn't have any issues with it falling out or not being secure. I personally just set mine in there and then install my roof piece, and then it won't go anywhere. So this is the roof piece. We're going to go ahead and install that now. Bolts go in the rear. I'm just going to push that bolt through there. Go to the other side, do the same thing. Alrighty, and then you can see those servo wires, that motor wire will hold that in place, especially once we get our battery mount in place. So before we go ahead and install our battery mount, take your stock battery strap, and you're going to want to take the circular hole side of it and put it on the skinnier end. That's going to be the side that faces the front of your chassis. So you can go ahead and set that plate in there. Is the assembly of the Warthog chassis. So the roof, you can see, does fold up for you to access your electronics. You can fold it down, pull the sides out a little bit, and it'll snap into place. The ESC is held in there. It's not going to go anywhere. It will not come out on you. I just like letting it sit in there, kind of rest in there. It does float around if you're not comfortable with that. Again, plenty of unique solutions that we could come up with there. So now we have our assembled Warthog here. You can see though, one of the issues with the Warthog after you assemble it is if you steer right, the axle is going to steer left, and if you steer left, the axle is going to steer right, and vice versa. So that's backwards. We need to reverse that servo. So what you do is you take your TQ radio on, you're going to go ahead and press the set button for about 2 seconds until that light starts blinking. You're going to turn the steering wheel to full lock in any direction, and then just tap this button again. Did that, and now you can see steering is correct again. And the final step here is going to be to replace your stock wheel hexes with the included wheel hexes in this kit. After I finished assembly, the first one I built was on wide axles and everything, so I didn't have this issue on it, but when I assembled it on here, I noticed that we had a slight bit of interference between the stock wheels and our modified steering setup. So what the kits will come with, in addition to everything that you see or have seen before in this video, is extended wheel hexes. So to install those, you just remove your stock wheel hexes, grab the extended ones out of your kit, and install your wheels. Thanks for checking out my video. I did want to show a comparison of a modified one to like a stock build one, if you will. This is a heavily modified TRX4M. We got some brass high clearance links, some monster wheels and tires on it, all shoved into a Warthog chassis. Then we got the stock one, which I think you'll be surprised at how capable it actually is. Regardless, thank you for sticking through and watching my video here on the how-to assembly of the Warthog. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me either here or on my Etsy page for tips and tricks on how to install these. If you do want to get your hands on one, go ahead and go to the link in the description below. They will be for sale on my Etsy page there. If you don't want to purchase one, but you do like the video and you like the content, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. It really does help me out a ton. So thanks again for coming by and checking out the video.